Lecture 14, Flaubert, Madame Bovary, Part 1.
In beginning this lecture on Flaubert's Madame Bovary, I'd like to refer you back for a moment to some of the remarks I made about the love letter form in Laclos' novel, The Liaison Dangereuse. And in particular, what I tried to get at was the incompatibility between the feeling of love, which should suggest a kind of reciprocity or mutuality, and the actual writing of a letter, which is a private, sometimes solipsistic, and frighteningly free operation. In Flaubert's book, which really can be thought of as a kind of anatomy, perhaps autopsy, of love, we look at the thing itself, not the letter form, but the actual phenomenon that we call love. I think this novel is famous in Western literature for the rather searing portrait that it gives us about love as something that may or may not exist, may or may not be possible. Could it be a construct? We want to think of love, of course, as something that's deep and vital and spontaneous and part of us. In this novel, I think we're led to question whether it could be a fabrication of sorts, and I'll talk more about what that could mean. And some of the more grisly consequences of that might be, are passion and marriage compatible? Because this is also a marriage text. That's a rough question, I think. I'm talking to you as somebody who's been married 42 years. Are passion and marriage compatible? What is the impact of time on human relationships? Those are some of the issues that I'm going to try to get into in these two lectures. Flaubert is a remarkable figure. He's got probably a whole slew of problems in his own makeup. We know that his own health was very problematic, that he had these mysterious, what people think of as seizures, very early in his life, and sort of became a hermit devoted to writing, even though he was a very attractive and vigorous young man with apparently an insatiable sexual appetite as well. So there's a lot of displacement in the figure of Flaubert himself and the way he conducted his life. He himself openly acknowledged that there was a kind of warfare inside of him between a romantic dreamer on the one hand and a realist critic, a very acerbic realist critic on the other. Another way of putting that is that Flaubert was a romantic who choked during the rest of his life on what he had absorbed. And all of his books seem to be an exploration and a punishment of desire. So Madame Bovary can be thought of as really staging the life and death of romance. And that's what I'm going to talk about a lot in this lecture. And in the next lecture, I'll talk more about its narrative complexity, which is no less interesting and important. The novel seems to display the making and unmaking of Emma Bovary. Making and unmaking, those are the words that I used, and I chose them very carefully because it suggests that a person could be made and unmade. Again, a rather unwelcome notion. We don't want to think of ourselves as constructible and taken apartable, if you will, in that fashion. But it's not just a remark about the possible factitiousness of the individual person. It's also, I think, a comment about writing. I mean, isn't that what writers do? They make and unmake their characters. Some people have said that every time a character dies in a novel, it's a murder. After all, the character doesn't die. The author exercises his or her own volition in order to lead these characters exactly as he or she sees fit. So a lot is going to be in play here about constructedness and about power and about control in this novel. Constructedness. Emma Bovary's education takes place in a convent, and that's an absolutely critical piece of information because the convent becomes the source of her fantasies and dreams about what reality is supposed to offer her. She is a voracious reader. She reads religious texts. She also reads romances. And she comes out of that reading as someone who is convinced that life is going to follow suit. In this regard, from a literary point of view, she follows in the footsteps of one of the great characters in earlier literature, Don Quixote, whose whole life was cued to the reading that he gave to chivalric romances and then made the kind of tragic or hysterical, depending on how you see it, blunder of going through life assuming that everything would follow as these romances had suggested.